No, you see, we live in a time where intimacy has been trivialized. People throw around acts of sexual generosity as if they're meaningless, as if they're detached from the profound biological, psychological, and even metaphysical realities underpinning them. But they're not. And this is important, because every intimate act is a manifestation of a deeper story, a narrative about trust, vulnerability, and the willingness to serve something beyond your narrow self-interest. You see, intimacy is not merely a physical interaction between two individuals. It's a profound and ancient ritual, one that reaches back into the deepest layers of human psychology and biology. When we talk about intimacy, particularly in the context of sexual acts that are focused on the other's pleasure, we're not simply describing a set of mechanical behaviors. We're speaking of an act imbued with meaning, one that operates on multiple levels at once seen biological, psychological, symbolic, and even spiritual. And this is something people don't fully grasp in the modern world, because we've reduced sexuality to something transactional, something casual, something devoid of its embedded significance. But the truth is that every intimate act participates in an archetypal drama, a pattern that transcends the individual and connects them to something greater. Consider for a moment the vulnerability that is required for such acts. Both participants are exposed, not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically. To allow oneself to be known in that way is no small thing. It requires trust, and not just a superficial kind of trust, but a deep trust that the other will not harm you, will not exploit you, will not humiliate you in your moment of openness. And for the man who engages in this act, who chooses to focus his attention and care entirely on his partner's pleasure, what he is doing is symbolically elevating her experience. He is saying, whether consciously or unconsciously, that her well-being, her satisfaction, her flourishing in that moment is worthy of devotion. And that's no trivial gesture. It's a profound recognition of the value of the other, an act that stands in stark contrast to a self-centered or purely hedonistic approach to intimacy. This is why intimacy, in its highest form, is transformative. It's transformative because it demands that we step outside of our narrow selves, that we sacrifice momentarily our own desires in service of the other. And that act of sacrifice is not a loss. Paradoxically, it's the pathway to deeper connection, deeper meaning, deeper fulfillment. The ancient myths understood this. They understood that to approach the feminine, to approach the unknown, to approach the realm of chaos and potential, required reverence, required humility. You don't approach the dragon's lair arrogantly, you approach it carefully, respectfully, because you know you're encountering something powerful, something that can transform you for better or for worse. In this sense, intimacy is a sacred act, whether or not we consciously acknowledge it as such. It's sacred because it has the potential to bind two people together in trust, in vulnerability, in mutual regard. And that binding is no something that happens automatically. It requires intention, attention, care. The man who approaches his partner with that level of care is enacting an ancient ritual of honoring the feminine, of acknowledging the generative power that resides there. He's not simply satisfying a biological urge. He's participating in a pattern of behavior that echoes through human history, one that affirms the value of the other and situates him within a relational structure oriented toward meaning. And when we lose sight of this, when we reduce intimacy to mere entertainment, we strip it of its capacity to transform us. We trivialize what should be revered. We flatten what should be deep. And this has consequences, not just for individuals, but for the culture as a whole. Because the way we treat intimacy reflects the way we treat meaning itself. If we approach intimacy casually without reverence, without recognition of its depth, then we train ourselves to approach other aspects of life with the same superficiality. But if we approach it as something sacred, as something worthy of care, then we cultivate within ourselves the capacity for responsibility, for depth, for love in the trust sense of the word. A humility and selflessness in sexual generosity are concepts that seem foreign to a culture increasingly obsessed with individual gratification, with getting rather than giving, with conquest rather than communion. But when you look beneath the surface, when you examine the underlying structure of intimate relationships, it becomes clear that true connection requires precisely those qualities in humility, the recognition that you are not the center of the universe, and selflessness, the willingness to prioritize the well-being of the other over the immediacy of your own desires. And this isn't weakness. It isn't servitude. It's strength. It's the kind of strength that allows you to voluntarily subordinate your ego in service of something greater than yourself. Because to be generous in intimacy is to make a choice. It's a choice to saying, I will not merely take, I will give. I will not simply use, I will uplift. And that choice is an act of maturity, an act of responsibility. It acknowledges that the other person is not an object for your gratification, but a subject with their own interior world, their own hopes, fears, desires, vulnerabilities. And to care for that, to tend to that with attention, with patience, with respect, is to place yourself in a posture of service, not in the sense of subjugation, but in the sense of meaningful contribution to the flourishing of another human being. Humility, in this context, means setting aside the demand that your pleasure must always come first. It means acknowledging that you don't know everything, that you might need to listen, to observe, to learn what truly brings joy to the other. It's the admission that intimacy is not a formula, not a checklist, but a dynamic process that requires attunement. And attunement demands humility because it requires you to admit that the other's experience might be different from yours, that their needs and desires might not align perfectly with your assumptions or expectations. And so you approach them not as a conqueror, but as an attentive partner, willing to adapt, willing to adjust, willing to serve. Selflessness, likewise, doesn't mean the erasure of the self. It doesn't mean ignoring your own needs or desires. Rather, it's the capacity to momentarily set them aside, to create space for the other's experience to be centered. And in doing so, something paradoxical happens. You don't lose yourself, you expand yourself. You become larger because you've stretched beyond the confines of your own ego, beyond the narrow circle of your own pleasure. You've entered into a relational space where giving and receiving are intertwined, where the act of giving becomes in itself a source of joy and fulfillment. This is why sexual generosity is not a mere technique or performance. It's not something you do to get something in return. It's an orientation of the heart, a stance of reverence toward the other's embodied experience. It's a recognition that intimacy is a shared journey, and that part of the journey involves lifting the other up, even if it means placing their needs above your own in that moment. And that lifting is not degrading. It's ennobling. It transforms the act from something transactional into something transcendent, from mere gratification into communion. When you approach intimacy with humility and selflessness, you're not just creating pleasure, you're cultivating trust. You're saying to the other, I see you, I honor you, I care enough to pay attention, I care enough to sacrifice my impatience, my entitlement, my need to control. And that sacrifice, however small it may seem, echoes far beyond the bedroom. It's a rehearsal for the kind of character that builds meaningful relationships in every domain of life. Because if you can be humble and selfless in the most vulnerable, most private moments, you train yourself to carry those virtues into the public sphere, into your friendships, your family, your work. You become someone capable of giving, not just taking, of serving, not just demanding, of loving, not just desiring. A courage in embracing feminine vulnerability is not merely a personal or psychological challenge. It's an existential task that has been represented symbolically in myths, stories, and religious traditions across cultures for millennia. To truly approach the feminine, not just the biological woman, but the archetypal realm of what the feminine represents, is to approach chaos, potential, creativity, emotion, unpredictability. And this is no simple undertaking. It requires bravery because it demands a willingness to enter into the unknown, to expose oneself to forces that cannot be controlled, to step outside the safety of order and predictability into the realm where transformation occurs. When a man chooses to engage intimately with a woman's vulnerability, he's not just participating in a physical act, he's participating in a profound psychological drama. The feminine, in its most fundamental form, represents the unknown, the source of life and transformation, but also the source of unpredictability and change. To draw near to that, to honor it, to care for it, to attend to it with reverence rather than domination, requires a level of courage that transcends physical bravery. It's a moral and emotional courage, the willingness to stay present in the face of uncertainty, to resist the temptation to control or escape, to stand firm in the midst of complexity. This is not a matter of weakness or passivity. It's an active, voluntary confrontation with the parts of life that cannot be neatly organized or fully understood. Feminine vulnerability is not something to be fixed or solved. It's something to be witnessed, to be held, to be protected without the arrogance of thinking it be mastered. And for a man, this demands a radical shift from the impulse to impose order by force to the capacity to allow space for what is mysterious and beyond him. That's not submission, that's strength of the highest kind, because it's strength exercised not in domination, but in containment, in the creation of a safe space where the other can unfold without fear. The act of embracing feminine vulnerability and intimacy, therefore, is a microcosm of this larger existential task. It's the willingness to be attentive to the emotional, psychological, and physical needs of the other, even when those needs are not easily articulated or understood. It's the capacity to hold presence, to stay with discomfort, to navigate the delicate balance between giving and receiving, leading and following, offering and waiting. And that navigation demands courage because it requires stepping outside one's ego, outside the impulse to reduce intimacy to a predictable script, and into the relational unknown where every moment must be discovered anew. In that act, there's a form of heroism, not the heroism of slaying dragons or conquering enemies, but the heroism of remaining present in the face of emotional openness, of not flinching from the reality of another's exposed humanity. Feminine vulnerability is not weakness. It's the courage to be seen, to risk rejection, to risk hurt, to risk disappointment, and to meet that vulnerability with your own courage, with a steadfast willingness to honor and protect it, is to create a bond that transcends mere physical connection. It's a bond rooted in mutual respect, in trust, in the recognition of each other's sacred humanity. This is why intimacy that honors vulnerability is transformative. It reshapes both individuals. The man who approaches the feminine with courage does not emerge unchanged. He is enlarged by the experience, deepened, made more whole. He learns patience, gentleness, attentiveness. He learns to relinquish control where control is neither possible nor desirable. He learns to accept the beauty and terror of intimacy as two sides of the same coin. And through that acceptance, he participates in the ancient dance between chaos and order, between the known and the unknown, between the masculine impulse to structure and the feminine invitation to grow beyond structure. The integration of chaos and order through intimacy is a concept that operates at multiple levels of human experience, from the psychological to the symbolic to the biological. At the heart of it lies a fundamental truthing that human beings are constantly negotiating the tension between the known and the unknown, between structure and possibility, between stability and transformation. The masculine principle, symbolically speaking, is associated with order, structure, predictability, rules, clarity. The feminine principle is associated with chaos, not in the pejorative sense, but in the sense of the unknown, the fertile ground of potential, the source of life and creativity. And it's within the space of intimacy that these two forces come into direct contact, where they dance, where they wrestle, where they strive toward integration. When a man approaches intimacy, he is not merely engaging in a physical interaction. He is stepping into the realm of the unpredictable. He is entering a space where control is limited, where emotions run deep, where vulnerability surfaces, where the outcomes cannot be precisely engineered. And that experience is, by definition, chaotic. But chaos is not inherently destructive. It's the ground from which new things emerge. It's the space where transformation is possible, where old patterns can be broken, where something greater can be born. And so the challenge for the man is not to impose rigid order on the chaos, not to dominate or subdue it, but to enter into relationship with it, to negotiate with it, to allow himself to be shaped by it while maintaining enough structure to avoid dissolution. Intimacy works of themselves and each other that lie outside conscious control. Desires emerge, fears surface, longings are revealed. And none of these can be neatly managed by logic or rules. They must be navigated through responsiveness, attunement, flexibility. This requires that the man bring his capacity for order, his steadiness, his clarity, his protective presence, into contact with the woman's vulnerability, fluidity, openness to experience. And in doing so, he does not negate her chaos. He makes space for it. He holds it. He honors it. He allows it to unfold within the safety of his structure. This process is not static. It's a living negotiation. Too much order suffocates, represses, deadens. Too much chaos overwhelms, destabilizes, fragments. But when balanced rightly, order provides the container within which chaos can manifest its creative potential without becoming destructive. And that balance is not something achieved once and for all. It's something enacted moment by moment, through attention, through care, through responsiveness to the needs of the other and the evolving dynamics of the relationship. It's a form of wisdom, a capacity to sense when to lead and when to follow, when to assert and when to yield, when to structure and when to surrender. This integration is transformative not only for the relationship but for the individuals themselves. The man who learns to integrate chaos and order and intimacy becomes more whole, more adaptable, more capable of navigating the complexities of life beyond the bedroom. He becomes less rigid, less fearful of the unknown, less obsessed with control for its own sake. At the same time, he does not abandon structure, he refines it, making it more flexible, more responsive, more aligned with the living reality of human connection. And the woman, in turn, encounters a space where her vulnerability is not exploited or dismissed, but valued, protected, elevated. Through intimacy, then, the archetypal masculine and feminine principles enact a drama that mirrors the fundamental dynamics of existence itself. The interplay of chaos and order is the engine of growth, the source of meaning, the birthplace of transformation. And in learning to integrate these forces within the intimate sphere, both partners participate in a deeper narrative, one that transcends mere physicality and touches the very heart of what it means to be human, the quest to bring harmony out of tension, to find meaning in the balance between stability and change, to cultivate love not as a mere feeling but as a disciplined, attentive, courageous engagement with the fullness of life. To transcend ego for mutual flourishing is to undertake one of the most difficult, yet most meaningful, tasks that human beings can pursue in intimate relationships. The ego, by its very nature, is self-centered. It seeks its own gratification, its own validation, its own control over outcomes. It wants to win. It wants to dominate. It wants to avoid vulnerability. And yet, true intimacy requires precisely the opposite. It requires the capacity to set aside the relentless demands of the ego in favor of something greater than the self, the flourishing of the relationship, the well-being of the other, the creation of a space where both individuals can grow and deepen together. This is not the same as self-erasure or submission to the whims of another. Rather, it's a voluntary act of humility, a conscious decision to recognize that the relationship is not a battlefield where one must conquer and the other must yield, but a shared project, a collaborative enterprise aimed at something higher than mere individual satisfaction. In this sense, intimacy becomes a form of moral striving. It's not just about pleasure or emotional closeness. It's about the cultivation of virtues like patience, empathy, generosity, and courage, virtues that temper the ego and orient the self toward the good of the other and the good of the union. When a man approaches intimacy with the intention of transcending his ego, he is engaging in a profound act of discipline. He is saying, I will not reduce this moment to a transaction. I will not use the other as a means to an end. I will enter into this encounter with attention, with respect, with a willingness to listen, to learn, to adapt. And this orientation fundamentally changes the dynamic of intimacy. It transforms it from an arena of taking into an arena of giving, from an expression of dominance into an expression of service, from an act of consumption into an act of co-creation. This is not easy. The ego resists. It wants to assert itself. It wants to be seen as powerful, desirable, competent, in control. To set that aside, even temporarily, feels like a risk. It feels like a diminishment. And yet, paradoxically, it's in that very relinquishing of ego that a deeper strength emerges. It's the strength of vulnerability, the strength of openness, the strength of being willing to encounter the other not as an object, not as a mirror for one's self-image, but as a subject in their own right. Complex, mysterious, worthy of reverence. In transcending ego, the man also makes possible a kind of mutual flourishing that cannot be achieved through self-interest alone. He creates a space where the woman's pleasure, her joy, her sense of being seen and valued can come forward without fear of manipulation or exploitation. And in doing so, he doesn't lose, he gains. He gains access to a depth of connection, a quality of trust, an intimacy that is richer and more fulfilling than anything the ego could achieve through force or performance. Because the paradox is that the more one seeks purely for oneself, the more isolated one becomes. But the more one gives, the more one opens, the more one attends to the needs of the other, the more love and joy return in kind. This movement beyond ego is also a necessary precondition for growth. The ego clings to certainty, to habits, to roles that feel safe and familiar. But intimacy demands evolution. It confronts each partner with their limits, their blind spots, their unresolved wounds. To transcend ego is to be willing to face those truths, not defensively, not with denial, but with courage and humility. It's to accept that love will challenge you, that it will stretch you beyond who you were, that it will call you to become more than you thought you could be, not by inflating your ego, but by refining it, by integrating it into a broader, more relational sense of self. The affirmation of trust and safety through intimate devotion is not merely a matter of emotional comfort or reassurance. It is a cornerstone of the psychological and relational architecture upon which meaningful human connection is built. Trust, by its very nature, is fragile, hard-won, and easily broken. It requires consistency, attention, and integrity. It grows slowly, but it can be shattered in an instant. And yet, it is the necessary precondition for vulnerability, for openness, for the kind of intimacy that moves beyond mere physicality into the realm of shared meaning. Safety, likewise, is not simply the absence of harm. It is the presence of a protective, caring environment in which the other feels free to reveal themselves without fear of ridicule, rejection, or betrayal. When a man chooses to engage in intimacy with an attitude of devotion, when he focuses his attention, his energy, his care on the well-being and fulfillment of his partner, he is doing more than providing physical pleasure. He is making a profound symbolic statement: I see you, I value, I honor your vulnerability, I will not exploit you, I will not use this moment to assert power or dominance. I will make this space safe for you to be fully yourself. And this declaration, whether spoken or implicit, has ripple effects far beyond the act itself. It communicates to the other that they are worthy of care, worthy of reverence, worthy of being known in their fullness. This trust and safety are not static qualities. They are dynamic, living realities that must be cultivated and maintained over time. They depend on repeated demonstrations of integrity, of responsiveness, of accountability. A single moment of attentiveness cannot compensate for a pattern of disregard or selfishness. Likewise, a single act of care cannot undo a history of neglect. But every act of devotion and intimacy contributes to a reservoir of trust, a storehouse of safety that enables both partners to risk greater openness, to explore deeper levels of connection, to face their own vulnerabilities with courage rather than fear. And this is not a trivial achievement. In a world where betrayal, abandonment, and objectification are all too common, to create a relational space defined by trust and safety is to enact a kind of rebellion against the forces of alienation and cynicism. It is to declare that love is possible, that care is possible, that mutual flourishing is possible, not as naive idealism, but as a disciplined, intentional practice. Intimacy becomes, in this light, a ritual of affirmation, a repeated enactment of the values that sustain human dignity and relational depth. Moreover, the affirmation of trust and safety through intimate devotion is not only beneficial for the partner, it is transformative for the man himself. It calls forth qualities of character that are often undeveloped in a culture fixated on individual achievement and self-gratification. It requires patience, humility, empathy, attentiveness, all virtues that refine the ego, that temper impulsivity, that orient the self towards something greater than immediate desire. In choosing to devote himself to the creation of trust and safety, the man aligns himself with a higher purpose, the cultivation of love as a moral and spiritual good. This devotion also demands that the man confront his own fears, his own insecurities, his own tendencies toward control or withdrawal. To provide safety for another, he must first become a safe place within himself. He must learn to regulate his own emotions, to manage his own impulses, to confront his own shadows. This is not an easy path. It is a path that requires courage, discipline, and a willingness to engage in ongoing self-examination. But it is a path that leads to deeper authenticity, to greater capacity for love, to the integration of strength and gentleness. In this sense, intimate devotion is not a passive or sentimental posture. It is an active, courageous stance. It is a commitment to show up again and again with presence and integrity, even when it is difficult, even when it is uncomfortable. It is a vow to hold space for the other's growth, to honor their vulnerability, to meet their trust with steadfastness. And through this devotion, intimacy becomes not merely a private act, but a profound expression of the human longing for connection, for belonging, for mutual recognition. No.